Hard. This is a work of speculative fiction. The species, organizations, and events depicted are entirely invented and are not intended to represent any real nation, people, or ongoing conflict. Hast we were never small. The Halcyon Concord had 52 member civilizations. Humanity was not one of them. That was not an oversight. It was a vote 39 in favor of continued exclusion, 6 against, 7 abstaining, cast beneath the ribbed glass dome of the long table on Oriolite Station. A ringworld, built by nobody currently living, inherited by committee, and never once redecorated. The chamber smelled faintly of ozone and old varnish. It always had. Nobody had gotten around to fixing that either. Administrator Threll Vachon of the Austri Trade Directorate gave the closing argument himself, because closing arguments were the part of his job he was genuinely good at, and because nobody else in the room wanted to be the one to say it out loud. He was not a cruel man. That was, in its own way, the most dangerous thing about him. He believed every word he was about to say. Humanity, he said, mandibles clicking softly around the vowels of a language that was not his first. Has held its current world for roughly 200,000 years, and has been capable of leaving it for less than 200. In that short span they have fought 11 wars on their own soil, large enough to register on our historical instruments. Their governments contradict one another on matters of basic fact. Their lifespans are brief enough that policy continuity across generations is, by their own admission, difficult. We are not voting to punish them. We are voting to be honest about what the data says. He had a point, several actually. He was also wrong, and would not learn how wrong for another 6 years, 5 weeks and 3 days. A younger delegate from the Thriac Accord, one of the 6 who voted against exclusion, asked to speak before the ballot closed. She was barely into her first term, and it showed in the way she gripped the edges of the podium a little too hard. We are a young species too, she said. 400 years ago, this same chamber voted on whether the Thriac Accord had the temperament to be trusted, with a border of our own. I have read the transcript. The arguments are almost word for word what Administrator Vachon has just given us. I would like the record to note that we survived being underestimated. I am less certain the next species we underestimate will be so lucky, or that we will be there in time to find out. Nobody in the chamber answered her directly, which was its own kind of answer. The presiding officer thanked her for her comments and called the vote. Vote passed. Humanity was designated Tier 4 Provisional, a classification that meant watched, catalogued, and revisited exactly once every quarter century, whether or not anything had changed. The last full assessment had been taken 71 years earlier, when human ships had barely cleared the orbit of their own moon's shadow. And nobody had updated the files since. Files like that rarely got updated. Nobody was punished for letting them go stale. And stale files were cheaper than new surveys, and the galaxy was very large, and humanity was, by every measure the Concord bothered to take, very small. That was the story the Concord told itself for 94 years. It was not, as it turned out, the whole story. It was simply the only part anyone had thought to look for. Camden's Reach was a water mining colony belonging to the Austri Trade Directorate, tucked along the frozen ring system of a gas giant nobody outside the directorate could pronounce correctly. It had 617,000 residents, a garrison built to deter smugglers. Around a Tuesday. Dr. Renata Ioha had the Tuesday off. She was 34, a hydroponics engineer who had transferred out from Lagos 11 years earlier for a research contract and then simply never left. Because the contract turned into a marriage, and the marriage turned into a boy named Kofi, who was 6, and who had opinions about breakfast that he defended with the seriousness of a tribunal. She made him eggs. He rejected them on procedural grounds. She made him different eggs. He accepted, grudgingly, as if doing her a favor. That was the whole peaceful part. It does not get any longer than that. Art, because nothing that happened after it left room for anything but what happened after it. The first ship came out of transit above the northern ice shelf at 6:41 local time, and it did not announce itself. It did not fire a warning shot, because the species behind it had never in its recorded history fired a warning shot at anyone. The garrison commander, Yelva Wren, had 11 seconds of warning before the first strike landed. A HIMARS, which was 11 seconds more than most of Camden's Reach received. And she spent every one of them doing exactly what her training told her to do. Raising shields on the orbital platform, broadcasting a general alarm on every civilian frequency the colony had, and ordering the 2 patrol cutters under her command to break formation and run for the relay station rather than stand and fight beside her. An order both crews initially refused, and then, under a second and much sharper order, obeyed. It was that refusal turned obedience that got the distress beacon off-world at all. Wren did not live to learn that. Her name appears in the incident report exactly once, in a single line, noting that the platform's final transmission cut off at 0650, 9 minutes after first contact. The garrison held for 9 minutes. 9 minutes is a long time to hold against an enemy that outnumbers you 19-1, and a short time to save 617,000 people. The distress beacon reached the nearest relay station 21 hours later, because the primary relay had been the first thing destroyed. And by the time a response fleet arrived, there was nothing left to defend, only things left to count. Renata Ioha was one of the things that got counted. Her file later would note only that she was 34, that she had 1 dependent, and that she had been found 900 meters from the hydroponics dome she managed, which, for reasons nobody in the tribunal ever fully explained to Kofi, who asked more than once, had survived intact. The attackers did not know her name. They did not know anyone's name. That analysts would later agree. Higher was the most unsettling detail in the entire incident report. Not the violence, but the complete absence of anything that suggested the violence had been personal at all. Kofi was found 4 hours after the garrison fell, in a maintenance shelter beneath the dome his mother managed, by a rescue technician named Priya Anand, who would later tell the tribunal that the boy had not cried, had not asked where his mother was, had simply asked whether the eggs he'd left half-eaten on the kitchen counter that morning were still there. It was, Anand said, the question that broke her composure for the first time in a 14-hour shift, because it was such a small, ordinary thing to still be worried about, and because she understood, looking at him, that some part of him already knew the answer, and was asking anyway, the way people ask questions they already know the answer to, when the alternative is silence. The Directorate's final casualty count for Camden's Reach took 11 days to compile and was revised twice, upward both times. As recovery teams reached sections of the colony, the first wave of responders had been unable to access. The number that eventually appeared in the official record was large enough that most people who read it skimmed past it, the way people skim past large numbers, which was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of forgetting the Concorde's 94-year-old file on humanity had been built from. Sensor logs from the two Austri patrol cutters that escaped the attack recorded something strange in the final 90 seconds before the garrison fell. A low, rhythmic pulse across every frequency band simultaneously, gone before any instrument could properly characterize it. Analysts who reviewed the footage flagged it, filed it, and moved on, because there was a great deal else to process, and the pulse did not appear to have done anything. Nobody connected it to anything. Not yet the species that took Camden's Reach called themselves nothing anyone had ever recorded, because they did not transmit, negotiate, or explain. The Concorde's Exocultural Office eventually settled on a working designation drawn from the sensor logs of the attack. Umbral Choir, for the way their ships moved in tight, layered formations that pulsed and folded, like something singing in a register nobody could hear. Hay came from beyond the rift, a stretch of uncharted dark past the Concorde's outermost survey line, and in the 6 weeks that followed Camden's Reach, they took 4 more targets, a fine listening post, 2 Thriac mining barges, and a Concorde border relay whose entire staff of 19 simply stopped transmitting mid-sentence. The attacks were not random. Analysts mapping the pattern found a slow, deliberate arc, bending inward toward the populated core of charted space, toward the long table itself, toward everything. The Concorde convened an emergency session. It did what emergency sessions do, it argued. The Austri Directorate called for immediate mobilization. We do not need to understand an enemy to stop one, said the Directorate's senior military delegate, a blunt, scarred officer named Torv Asai. We need ships in the right place before they arrive in it. The fine compact whose entire culture was organized around consensus and restraint, called instead for contact attempts. Every war this Concorde has ever fought, their delegate said, was at some point a failure to try talking first. I understand. This may be different. I would like the record to show that we tried to find out before we decided it was. With respect, Asai said, how do you propose we transmit a peace offering to a fleet that has never once acknowledged receiving a signal, while it is actively destroying our colonies? I don't propose it will work, the fine delegate said. I propose that a Concorde which does not at least attempt it before resorting to force is a Concorde I am no longer certain I recognize. Nobody had an answer for that either. The Thriac Accord's delegate, a quiet analyst named Perrin Oxel, who rarely spoke in full session, ended the argument by simply putting numbers on the main display: fleet readiness projections, shipyard output, crew training timelines. A coordinated Concorde response, fully assembled, would take 4 months. A Umbral Choir, extrapolating from its current pace, would reach the populated core in roughly 7 weeks. I am not taking a position on whether to fight or negotiate, Oxel said into the silence that followed. I am telling you that whichever we choose, we do not currently have 4 months to choose it in. Vashon sat through all of it, somewhere in the second day of arguments, alone in his office at 2 a.m. station time. He pulled up Humanity's Tier 4 file out of a habit he could not fully explain to himself. He read the 71-year-old assessment twice, he noticed, almost as an afterthought, a gap in the historical record, a period roughly 22 years earlier, where human deep space transmission activity had dipped sharply and then never fully recovered its old chattiness, as though something had made them quieter. He made a note of it. He did not know what the note meant. He filed it, the way he filed everything. A hand went home. He would remember that note later. He would wish later that he had done more than file it. The captain, soon to be Admiral Yuki Castellan, had spent 31 years in the human deep space fleet, had watched the first generation of long-range cruisers get welded together in the Ceres yards. Had, until the morning this story actually starts, never once spoken to a non-human intelligence. A signal reached Lagrange Relay 4 at 3:14 station time on a frequency nobody at the relay had ever used, structured in a format no human system had a name for. Ranuled. Lieutenant Dario Reyes had been awake for 22 hours managing a debris sweep and was 4 minutes from ending his shift when the board lit up in a color the manual did not assign a meaning to. Most of the message was noise to his system, dense, layered, untranslatable. High, but 3 pieces of it had been deliberately encoded in universal mathematical notation, because whoever sent it had been smart enough or desperate enough to assume the recipient might not share a single word of language with them. The first piece was a set of coordinates, the second was a timestamp, 5 weeks out. High. The third was a number, 942. A count of hostile vessels. Reyes stared at it for a long moment. Then he did the thing he always did when he needed his hands to stop shaking before he made a decision. He set his coffee down very precisely, squared to the edge of the console, and opened a direct line to Earth Command. I need the Admiral. She's in a resource allocation hearing, Lieutenant. I'll get her out of it. A pause, the kind that has its own weather inside it. Sir, tell her, Reyes said. We just received first contact. And they're asking for help. 3 seconds of silence then. Connecting you now. There was a 4th piece buried in the signal, the one that took the cryptography team 11 days to fully isolate. A long, recurring mathematical sequence that did not fit any obvious purpose. It repeated 4 times, always identical, always in the same place relative to the coordinates. Nobody on the human side understood why it was there. But they flagged it the way Vachon had flagged his 22-year gap and moved on to more urgent problems. It would matter later. Almost everything unexplained in those first 11 days would matter later. Admiral Castellan did not sleep that first night, and would not sleep properly for the following 9. What she did instead was authorize something that had, until that message arrived, existed only as a line item in a budget nobody outside 4 rooms in the entire solar system was cleared to read. 22 years earlier, a survey drone on a routine deep system pass had picked up a fragment of wreckage that did not match any known human, or, as far as anyone could then tell, non-human design. It was small, it was silent, and it was old, and the engineers who examined it concluded 2 things that changed the shape of human policy for the following 2 decades. First, that whatever had built it did not appear to be friendly by design. Its systems were built for concealment and rapid violence, not communication. Second, that if something like it existed once, it likely was not the only one, and humanity had exactly no defense against it, and no one to call. Out of that finding came the Aegis Initiative. Not a fleet, not yet, but a promise that the next time something like that fragment showed up, humanity would not be found standing empty-handed. 14 shipyards went up over the following 2 decades, hidden in the debris fields and hollowed rock of the outer belt, run by a rotating staff that eventually totaled just under 60,000 engineers, technicians, and crew, every one of whom signed a non-disclosure agreement that did not expire, that many of them kept even from their own families, because the program's leadership had decided, correctly, as it turned out, that a secret held by 60,000 quiet people was safer than a secret rumored by 600 loud ones. They built ships, Warden-class carriers, first of their kind, larger and stranger than anything the public fleet had ever floated. High-built weapons nobody had a battlefield reason to need yet. Heart, and they built, almost as an afterthought, almost as the kind of thing a curious engineer builds, because a problem interested her, rather than because anyone ordered it. An experimental system designed to answer one very specific question. If an enemy fleet ever moved in perfect, inhuman coordination, was there a way to make it stop moving that way, without simply killing every ship in it, one at a time? Dr. Soren Cade had been asking that question for 6 years, before anyone outside her lab cared about the answer. Kai. She had lost a brother on a merchant survey run 11 years earlier, an unexplained disappearance, no wreckage, no distress call, filed and forgotten by everyone except her, and she had never quite let go of the idea that whatever took him had not been acting alone, and had not been acting like anything human battle doctrine was built to fight. A coordination like that, she believed, had to come from somewhere. A shared channel, a signal, something you could, in theory, jam, spoof, or break. Nobody had taken the idea seriously enough to fully fund it, until 19 days after Lieutenant Reyes set his coffee down. Admiral Castellan's formal offer of assistance did not reach Vachon's desk directly. It reached first the Auralite Traffic and Correspondence Office, whose duty clerk informed the Human Liaison Team that unsolicited communications from non-member entities were logged for review and typically addressed within 6 to 8 weeks. And that expedited handling required a sponsoring delegate, a form the clerk could provide but could not, himself, fill out on their behalf. The liaison team found a sponsoring delegate, a junior fine trade officer sympathetic to the request, and the offer moved, second, to the Austri Directorate's External Petitions Bureau, where a supervisor named Åsa Fenn read the summary, agreed privately that the timing was alarming, and explained, not unkindly, that petitions touching active Concord military policy required review by the Defense Coordination Subcommittee, whose next scheduled session was, as it happened, 11 days after the Umbral Choir's projected arrival at the border. I understand the irony, Fenn told the liaison officer, a young fine woman named Ossel Tarek, who had spent 4 straight days trying to move a single document 3 desks closer to anyone with the authority to act on it. I did not write the calendar I would ask you to escalate, except that escalation also requires a form, and the form also requires a sponsoring delegate of sufficient rank, which I am not. There is supposed to be an expedited channel for exactly this, Tarek told Fenn, not quite managing to keep the frustration out of her voice. The one they built after the Kesh Frontier incident. A convoy that never got its medical clearance in time. They rewrote half the emergency intake procedure because of that. It has a name. Everyone in this building trained on it. The Callaway Protocol applies to member species humanitarian requests. Fenn said, "This is a non-member military request. It is technically a different form." Tarek escalated anyway, on her own authority, by walking the physical printout to Vachon's office herself and refusing to leave the anteroom until someone read it. It took her 3 hours. It was, by the standards of the Auralite bureaucracy, an act of minor heroism that nobody would ever formally recognize. And the only reason Vachon saw the offer before the Umbral Choir crossed another border was that a tired, fine diplomat had decided that politeness had a limit, and hers had been reached. Vachon was the one who delivered the Concord's answer to the human envoy. Once it finally reached him, because delivering answers no one wanted to hear was, again, the part of his job he was good at. The Concord. appreciates the offer of information, he said, across a translated channel that rendered his voice smooth and unbothered in a way his actual mandibles were not. However, direct military coordination with a TFR species falls outside established protocol. Hi, we will of course keep your government appraised. Appraised. The word did a great deal of quiet administrative violence in that sentence. Apart, and everyone on both ends of the channel understood it. Admiral Castellan's reply took 4 seconds longer than diplomatic protocol strictly required. Administrator, she said, we have 5 weeks before 1942 ships arrive at your coordinates. We have a fleet. We are asking to bring it. You are welcome to keep us appraised of your decision from wherever your survivors end up. Hard. Vachon did not have a scripted response for that. Nobody had briefed him for a TFR species that spoke to a sitting Concord administrator like an equal, mostly because nobody had ever needed to. Akaya. He took the recording to the emergency session himself, against the advice of 2 colleagues who told him it would embarrass the directorate. He played it for the full chamber. Then he said something that 6 years later people would still quote back to him, usually with more warmth than he'd expected to ever receive for it. We do not actually know what the humans have, he said. Hard. Our last assessment is 71 years old. I would like someone in this chamber to explain to me why we are still treating a 71-year-old document as current intelligence, while a fleet of 1942 ships crosses the border. Nobody could explain it. The vote to formally request human assistance, not appraisal, assistance, passed 44-2 with 6 abstentions and took 11 minutes, which by Concord standards was closer to instantaneous than deliberate. But even open doors take time to walk through, and the Umbral Choir did not wait for procedure. But in the 18 days that followed, they took a 3-ic relay station and a fine agricultural moon, high, and the shape of the arc on every strategic display in the Concord, bent a little further inward, a little more certain, a little more like a hand closing. First, Concord Human Liaison meeting took place aboard the Warden-class carrier Meridian, 6 days before the Umbral Choir's projected arrival, and it was, by every account later filed, a genuinely uncomfortable 4 hours. Hard. Vachon arrived expecting, he admitted this later, once he trusted the people he was admitting it to, something closer to a militia than a navy. What he found instead was a joint operations floor with more raw processing power than the entire Austri Third Fleet, populated by engineers who spoke about frequency theory, the way Concord scholars spoke about scripture, and a fleet manifest that included 611 vessels the Concord's most recent intelligence estimate had insisted did not exist. Admiral Castellan opened the briefing herself, plainly, without ceremony, the way she opened every briefing. 14 shipyards, she said, 22 years, just under 60,000 people, most of whom signed away the right to ever tell their own families what they did for a living, on the theory that someday something would come across our border that we had no other way of surviving. Hart, we did not build this fleet in the 6 weeks since your envoy's message reached us, Administrator. Had. We built it in the 22 years before anyone told us we needed to. High. Somewhere in the back of Vachon's mind, a small administrative detail clicked into place with an almost audible sound. 22 years earlier, in the 71-year-old file he had reread at 2 in the morning during the first emergency session, a human deep space transmission activity had gone quiet and never fully recovered its old volume. Heil, he had noted it, filed it, and never once connected it to anything, because a note in a stale file was not the sort of thing a busy administrator followed up on. He understood now, standing on that operations floor, precisely what had gone quiet 22 years earlier, and precisely why. Vashon did not respond immediately. He had spent 94 years, and the whole of his professional life within them, operating on the assumption that a species classified Tier 4 provisional was, definitionally, a species that had not yet done anything worth reclassifying. He found, standing on that operations floor, that the assumption did not survive contact with 60,000 names on a program roster he was not, strictly, cleared to see, and that Castellan had shown him anyway. Why? Tell me this now, he asked, rather than simply deploying it and explaining afterward. Because you asked us for help honestly, Castellan said, after 94 years during which nobody on your side of this table asked us anything at all. I decide that deserved something better than being managed. Found Dr. Soren Cade standing in front of a display that meant nothing to him, layered waveforms, dense and pulsing, trying to explain something to a room of skeptical human officers that none of them, including her, were fully certain would work. A pulse in the Camden's Reach sensor logs, she said, the one everyone flagged and nobody explained. That wasn't random interference. If it's a synchronization signal, it's how they move as one thing instead of 1900 separate ones. Akishan, it's not a metaphor. When we call them a choir, they're actually singing to each other. In a register, we didn't have instruments sensitive enough to fully catch until 3 weeks ago. A permanent. When we started comparing it against the recurring sequence buried in the Directorate's original contact message. Hi. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something clicks that shouldn't be possible to click that fast. That sequence your survey ships picked up, Cade continued, looking at Vashon now. It wasn't noise either. It's a partial fragment of the same signal, recorded years ago by an Austri listening post near the rift and never analyzed. Because nobody knew what they were looking at. Put the two together, your old data, our new instruments, and we don't just know the umbral choir sings. We know roughly what key they sing in, and if we break the harmony, said a voice from the back of the room, Admiral Castellan, who had been listening without interrupting for the better part of 40 minutes. They stop moving like one fleet. They start moving like 1900 confused ones. Front. A fleet captain near the front, a broad-shouldered man named Halvorsen, who had spent the entire briefing with his arms crossed, finally spoke up. With respect, Doctor, you're describing a system that has never been tested against a live enemy fleet, based on a theory built from 90 seconds of sensor noise and a signal fragment somebody found by accident in an archive. We have 5 days. You're not wrong, Cade said. She did not flinch from it, which surprised him more than an argument would have. In the 11 years I've worked on this, I have had exactly 4 days where I was more confident it would work than I was that it wouldn't. Today isn't one of the good 4. I can tell you it's the only thing we have that isn't just more guns pointed at more ships. And I can tell you the program almost got cancelled twice. Once 9 years in, when a review board decided a countermeasure, with no confirmed target, was an unjustifiable use of shipyard capacity, and once 4 years ago, when the same board asked why we were still funding a weapon against an enemy we'd never even made contact with. Both times, somebody senior enough to overrule the board decided that being ready for a threat nobody could prove existed yet was worth the cost of being wrong. I don't have a better answer than that. I have 22 years of somebody's stubbornness. And 5 days to find out if it was worth it. Halvorson did not answer that right away. When he did, it was not an apology exactly, but it was close. "Walk me through the deployment," he said, and pulled a chair closer to the display. An Austrian liaison officer standing beside Vachon, one of the two sensor specialists who would, within days, be working directly with Katie's team, raised a different question. Your government kept this from us for 22 years, she said, not accusing, simply asking. Now you are handing us the design specifications in an afternoon. Akai, why the change? Because 22 years ago we didn't know you existed, and the thing we were afraid of hadn't announced itself yet, Castellan said. Secrecy was never the point, readiness was the point. The moment readiness required trusting someone else with what we'd built, we stopped being secret about it. We are not interested in being the only species that survives what's coming. We'd very much prefer not to find out what that would even look like. That answer went into the official record of the meeting, and Vachon would, years later, cite it more often than any other single sentence spoken during the war, including several of his own. Nobody in that room had built a weapon that killed a single Umbral ship. What they had built in 22 years of quiet work that outlasted 3 administrations and 1 near cancellation was a way to make the enemy's greatest advantage, its terrifying, silent, perfect coordination, turn against itself. It would not be enough on its own. Everyone in that room understood that, but it was, for the first time since Camden's Reach, something other than a number. Admiral Castellan spent the same night alone in her quarters, aboard the Meridian, door locked, with a photograph of a colony named Camden's Reach that she had requested from the Austri Directorate's public casualty records. Not because anyone had asked her to look at it, but because she had made a habit, over 31 years, of never sending people into a fight without first making herself look at exactly what the fight was for. As she sat with it, for 11 minutes, she allowed herself to cry, once quietly, in the specific unwitnessed way commanding officers learn to grieve, so that grief never once shows up on a bridge. Then she washed her face, put the photograph away, and did not mention it to anyone for the rest of the war. Vachon spent the night before the battle not sleeping, standing at the observation deck of Aurelite Station, looking at the arc of red icons on the situation display, the same arc he had watched bend closer for 6 weeks. Somewhere behind him, a junior aide he barely knew asked, without meaning anything unkind by it, whether he thought the humans would actually show up. They already have, Vachon said, and did not elaborate, because there was nothing in his long, careful career that had prepared him to explain the particular feeling of having been comprehensively, professionally wrong about something for 94 years. The Concorde fleet numbered 519 warships, assembled from every major member species, plus 9 cruisers from the Fine Compact and 6 from the Thriac Accord, both offered within hours of the emergency vote, old, slower ships, but crewed by people who had watched the Ark bend toward their own borders too. A human fleet arrived 4 days ahead of the projected Umbral crossing, and it did not arrive quietly. 611 vessels dropped out of long-range transit in staggered formation across the defensive line. Warden-class carriers at the anchor points, each one nearly a kilometer of hull that had spent 2 decades existing only as a rumor in a budget line. Escort classes, threading the gaps between them, and at the center of it all, 7 vessels of a design the Concorde's intelligence office had genuinely never logged before. are built around KD's synchronization disruption array and nicknamed by the crews who flew them Acquire Breakers, a joke that stopped being funny approximately 1 hour before the battle started and became, afterward, the only name anyone ever used for them again. Vashon, given a place in the observation gallery of the Meridian as the Concorde's official liaison to the engagement, watched the human fleet complete its deployment in a silence that several of the officers near him mistook for professional composure. It was not composure, it was the particular, disorienting quiet of watching a number you have spent your entire career treating as an abstraction resolve. All at once, into 611, very real, very large, very present ships, arranged with a precision that suggested this was neither the first nor the 10th time this fleet had rehearsed exactly this formation. Lieutenant Dario Reyes had requested and been granted a transfer to the Meridian's forward operations floor 3 weeks earlier, a decision his old commanding officer at Lagrange Relay 4 had called reckless and his new one had called overdue. Hindu. He was the one who, at 0509 on the 6th day, watched the long-range sensor array register the first ripple of the Umbral fleet, dropping out of transit. And he was the one who said, into a comm channel carrying his voice to 519 Concorde ships and 611 human ones, the same 4 words he had said to an empty relay station months earlier, except this time the whole fleet was listening. The contact confirmed, they're here. The Umbral Choir crossed the border at 0512 on the 6th day. There was no warning shot from them because there never was. There was this time something waiting. The Battle of the Camdon Line lasted 6 hours. And for the first 11 minutes, the same length of time the garrison at Camdon's Reach had held. A detail nobody planning the engagement had chosen on purpose, and everybody noticed anyway. It looked, on every tactical display in the joint fleet, exactly as bad as everyone had privately feared. Umbral Choir moved as it always moved, as one thing wearing 1900 hulls, folding and reforming with a precision no coordinated Concorde battle plan had ever matched, absorbing the first wave of joint fire with a kind of terrible, silent economy. The 3-act cruiser went dark in the 2nd minute. A fine escort followed in the 4th. Vashon, watching from the Meridian's observation gallery, because there had been nowhere else for a Concorde liaison to stand and be useful, felt the old, familiar shape of the last 6 weeks close, back in around his chest. Then, at minute 11, the 7 choir breakers activated. What the array did, in terms simple enough for a battle log to record, was flood the Umbral synchronization frequency with a distorted echo of its own harmonic pattern, not loud enough to jam it outright, but close enough, warped enough, to make the individual Umbral ships briefly, catastrophically uncertain which signal was the real one. Howl. For roughly 4 seconds, the fleet that had never once broken formation in any recorded engagement did not know, ship to ship, what the rest of itself was doing. 4 seconds does not sound like very much. It was in a battle built entirely around perfect coordination. Everything. Reyes, watching from the Meridian's ops floor, saw it first as a change in the shape of the enemy formation on the tactical display. A shudder, a fractional widening of gaps that had not existed a heartbeat earlier. He did not have time to feel anything about it before the next order came down the line. Harmond, and later, when people asked him what it had been like to watch the theory actually work, he said it had not felt like triumph. It had felt like watching a held breath finally let go. The Umbral formation did not shatter. It stumbled, hesitated in a way analysts would spend years afterward trying to precisely describe, Because hesitated was not a word anyone had ever applied to that species before. And in that stumble, a joint fleet did what joint fleets exist to do. It stopped reacting and started attacking. The human carrier groups punched through the gap the disruption opened. Osprey cruisers, adapted with a version of Cady's array, shared freely, and without condition the moment the technology proved itself, widened it. 3x sensor coverage, more sophisticated than anything any single species in the fleet had ever fielded alone. It told every captain in the formation exactly where the seams were before the seams had time to close again. It was not a clean battle. Nothing about it was clean. Ships died on both sides, in numbers that would take weeks to fully count. The worst of it came at the 2-hour mark, when a cluster of roughly 90 Umbral vessels, cut off from the main formation by the disruption field, but not disabled by it, turned as a single unit and drove directly at the weakest seam in the joint line. A stretch held by 2 of the Fine Compact's aging cruisers and a 3x escort wing that had already lost a third of its ships. Halvorsen, commanding the forward group from the carrier, Ansel Cade, named without much subtlety, High, for the woman who had built the array that made the whole engagement possible, watched the cluster close the distance and made the call that would be studied in joint command academies for years afterward. He committed his own carrier group directly into the gap ahead of the reserve, without waiting for the order he knew Castellan would eventually give and did not have time to ask for. And it worked, in the sense that the line held. It cost the Ansel Cade both of its forward shield arrays and 11 of its fighter craft, and cost the 3x escort wing the last of its ships. And there was a moment, recorded in 11 separate ship logs, where the joint fleet's forward line came close enough to breaking that Admiral Castellan gave. Hard, and then immediately rescinded, an order to commit the full reserve early, a decision she would later say cost her more sleep than the entire rest of the war combined. Hart, made in the same 7 seconds, it took Halvorsen's group to close the gap on its own and render the order unnecessary. But the Umbral Choir, for the first time in every engagement anyone had a record of, retreated. It did not surrender. It did not communicate. It simply, at the 4-hour mark, turned as one broken, uncertain mass, and folded back out past the border it had crossed, leaving behind wreckage and silence and, for the joint fleet holding the line, something that took most of them another hour to correctly identify as the feeling of having won. Cade watched it happen from the operations floor of the Meridian, hands shaking, and said nothing for a long time. Somebody asked her eventually if she was all right. My brother used to say, she said, that the worst thing about losing to something is not knowing what it was. I think I just found out what it was. She did not smile. Nobody who understood what the last 22 years had cost expected her to. Akadil. 3 days after the battle, once the wreckage recovery teams had finished their preliminary survey of the engagement zone, Cade requested, and was given a berth on one of the salvage tenders, combing the debris field for anything worth recovering. High, she did not tell anyone what she was looking for, and never found it, and everyone who worked with her closely enough to guess did not ask. High, she came back from that trip quieter than she had been before it, and slightly less angry, in a way that took people who had known her for years a while to notice, because it was not the kind of change that announced itself. I used to think I was building this to answer a question, she told Halvorsen once, months later, over a drink neither of them had particularly wanted, but both needed. High, now I think I was building it so that the answer wouldn't matter as much anymore. It still doesn't tell me what happened to him. It tells me it won't happen to as many other people's brothers going forward. I've decided that's close enough to hold on to. There was a debate in the hours after the retreat about whether to pursue. The Umbral fleet was broken, disoriented, and, for the first time in living memory of any species at that table, vulnerable in a way that would likely never repeat itself. Several officers, on both the human and Concord sides, argued, not unreasonably, that a fleet capable of ending the threat permanently, following the retreat past the rift, and finishing what 6 hours of desperate defense had only started, had an obligation to do exactly that. Admiral Castellan listened to the argument in full before she answered it. Code. We built the choir breakers to make them stop, she said. Hide. Not to make them disappear. I don't know what's past that border, and neither does anyone in this room. And I am not sending exhausted crews into the dark to chase a wounded enemy on the strength of one good day. We held the line. That was the mission. The mission is complete. Vashaun, still standing in the observation gallery, still not entirely sure what to do with the last 6 hours, found himself agreeing with her before he'd finished deciding whether he was allowed to. The fleet did not pursue. The Umbral choir crossed back past the rift and did not return that year or the next, and the joint command that had assembled to stop them did not disband because, as more than one officer put it in the after-action review, a fleet you build in 6 weeks under emergency conditions is not the fleet you want waiting for you if the enemy that made you build it decides to come back better prepared. Instead, over the following months, something slower and stranger than a war happened. Halcyon Concord formally, and by unanimous vote, 39-0, with the same 39 delegates who had once voted for exclusion now voting the other way. A detail that several journalists across the Concord's member worlds found impossible to resist printing, extended full membership to humanity. Not provisional, not tiered, full. Vashaun argued for the Joint Defense Framework himself, and in the same chamber, from the same podium where he had once explained, in under 10 minutes, why humanity did not belong. He did not pretend the two speeches were unrelated. He opened the second one by referencing the first on the record, because he had decided somewhere in the 6 months between them that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. The framework that emerged took 11 months of negotiation to finalize and included mutual defense clauses no two Concord species had ever extended to one another before. Not reserve elements, not diplomatic gestures, but full military commitment, ratified, binding, and permanent. Intelligence was shared without qualification. The choir breaker array was distributed to every Allied shipyard that wanted it. Without the licensing restrictions that governed nearly every other piece of shared military technology in Concord history, because Cade had insisted, in the one negotiating session she personally attended, that a weapon built to protect everyone stopped working the moment it belonged to only one of them. Frustry, the Ostri contributed sensor doctrine refined over centuries. Fine, the Fane, whose culture still would not build offensive weapons, built instead the finest early warning network anyone in the Joint Command had ever operated. The same network that would, years later, spot the next Umbral build-up 4 full months before it crossed the border. 4 months of preparation that had not existed the first time. Because the first time, nobody had known there needed to be a first time. Hammond. News of the retreat reached the Concord's member worlds within hours, and reached Earth roughly 40 minutes after that, delayed only by the ordinary lag of distance. On Auralite Station, the long table held an open session that ran long past its scheduled close. High, not because anyone had new arguments to make, but because nobody wanted to be the one who left first. On Earth, in a dozen languages across a dozen time zones, people who had spent 5 weeks quietly rehearsing what they would tell their children if the fleet did not come home instead, spent an evening not quite believing that it had. Osel Tariq, the fine liaison officer, who had walked a single printout across 3 offices and refused to leave an anteroom, watched the announcement from the same anteroom, alone, and cried in a way she later described to Fenn as extremely undignified and entirely worth it. Heart. There is a photograph that hangs now in the Joint Command Museum on Oralite Station, taken from a recon drone at the height of the Camden Line engagement. It shows the Warden-class carriers in the foreground, fighter bays open, engine trails still visible as pale streaks against the dark. Heart. Further out, blurred by distance, sits the dense black mass of the Umbral Formation, and between the two fleets is an almost unreasonable amount of light, weapons fire. The detonations, the pale flare of the choir breaker arrays, doing whatever it is they do to a signal nobody outside, a handful of engineers ever fully understood. Apartment. From a distance it looks almost beautiful, which is one of the quietly terrible things about photographs of battles. All of that light did real things, to real ships, with real people inside them. Hard. But the photograph shows something else too, if you look at it long enough. It shows the Umbral Formation pulling back. In every other recorded image of that species in the Concorde's long archive, the shape they made was a fist, closing. In this one, for the first time, the fist is open. A group of school children stood in front of that photograph on a Tuesday, 3 years after the battle, the way school children do, half listening to a docent who had clearly given this particular tour too many times to still find it interesting. One of them, a boy near the back, 9 years old now, kept looking at the photograph after the group had already started to move on. His name was Kofi Iyoha, and his class had come to Oralite Station on an exchange program. Nobody had thought to check the roster of closely enough to notice whose son he was. And if the docent had known, she never let on. Hi, did we do that? He asked her. And she had actually been human, though the museum served all 53 member species now. We did, the docent said. All of us together, how? Hi, the docent did not have a rehearsed answer for that one, or chose not to use it. Hi, because some people spent 22 years building something nobody thanked them for. She said, and when the day came that it mattered, they weren't asked to explain themselves. They were just ready. Kofi thought about that for a while, the way children think about things adults say and mean. Filing it somewhere it would stay. Hi, he did not tell her about Camden's Reach, or the maintenance shelter, or the eggs. He had learned, over 3 years, which parts of his own story to keep for himself. Hi. I want to build something nobody thanks me for, he said eventually, with the specific gravity only a 9-year-old can bring to a sentence like that. Hi. The docent smiled and did not correct him, because there was nothing to correct. Hi. The Joint Defense Framework was signed beneath the same ribbed glass dome, where the exclusion vote had once passed, on a stage built for the occasion in front of delegates from all 53 worlds. Admiral Castellan signed for humanity. Vashon, who had by then been elevated to senior counselor, had signed on behalf of the Austri Trade Directorate, and did so with the same careful, unhurried hand he used for every document he considered important, which was, his aides had learned over the years, not very many of them. A comment. For the record, Vashon said afterward to the assembled press pool, when a Thriac correspondent asked him whether he regretted his closing argument from 6 years earlier, "I do not think the argument itself was made in bad faith. I think it was made from a file that was 71 years out of date, which is a different failure, a hunder and a more common one, and I would like this Concorde to be considerably less comfortable with stale files going forward than it has been for most of its history." Hi, nobody in the press pool had a follow-up question ready for that. It ran unedited on every major Concorde news feed within the hour. 6 years, 5 weeks, and 3 days after the vote that had excluded humanity from the Concorde in the first place. Threl Vachon stood at the same observation deck on Orelite Station, where he had once told a junior aide the humans had already shown up, and gave a speech he had not fully written down, because by then he trusted himself to say the true thing without a script. Cold. "We spent 94 years, he said, to a chamber that included, for the first time in its history, a full human delegation seated not at the back, but at the long table itself, measuring a species by a file that was 71 years out of date, a hand calling it thorough. We called them small, because the only thing we had ever bothered to look for was size. What we found, when we finally looked properly, was not smallness. It was patience. It was 22 years of quiet work nobody asked them to do, kept secret not out of pride, but out of the simple. A stubborn belief that the day might come when it mattered, and it did, and they were ready. And we were not, and they came anyway." A key. He paused. The chamber, for once, did not fill the silence with argument. "Hi, we were wrong about what we were looking at," he said. "Harvey, we were never looking at something small. We were looking at something we had simply never bothered to see. We were never looking at small. We were only looking at unseen." He said it again, quieter, hard, and this time it was not a correction of the record, but something closer to an apology that the Concorde's formal language did not have a better word for. Permanent. "We were never small, we were only unseen," and a third time at the very end, not to the chamber this time, but out toward the observation window, toward the dark, where the rift line still held, where joint patrols still ran every 6 hours, whether or not anyone was watching them do it, where a fleet built out of shared shame and shared stubbornness now flew under flags from 53 worlds instead of 52. "We were never small," he said. "We were only unseen." The Umbral Choir came back 7 years later, exactly the way every officer who had studied the Ark always privately expected they would. Heart. This time the early warning network caught the build-up 4 months out. 4 months that did not exist the first time are spent moving reserve fleets into position, refreshing the choir breaker arrays with 6 new refinements. Hard, and evacuating 3 border settlements, the Joint Command was no longer willing to leave undefended and hope. The engineering team that met the second wave was not the one that had built the first choir breakers, alone in a hidden shipyard nobody outside 4 rooms in the solar system had known about. It now included, alongside Cady, 2 Austri sensor specialists on permanent joint assignment, a fine architect whose early warning doctrine had already saved the fleet 4 months it desperately needed, and a young Thriac tactical officer named Sarath Vek, 18 months into the joint staff, who had spent most of that time quietly convinced that the original patrol doctrine had a gap nobody senior enough to fix it had bothered to look for. And who turned out, when the build-up was finally confirmed, to have been right. Reyes commanded a ship of his own by then, one of 12 new Swift-class vessels built to Vek's revised doctrine. And it was his squadron that first confirmed the Umbral fleet's approach vector, 4 months and 11 days before the border crossing. High in a transmission that echoed, almost word for word, without either of them intending it to. The one he had sent from an empty relay station years earlier. "The contact confirmed," he said. "They're here. This time we knew they were coming. The battle lasted 4 hours this time, not 6. The umbral formation, larger than before, and reorganized into a structure the Joint Fleet's analysts believed was a deliberate countermeasure to the original disruption pattern, held together for nearly 90 minutes against the refreshed choir breaker arrays before the first seams opened, longer than the first engagement, but not long enough. The Joint Fleet, 7 years more practiced at fighting as one thing instead of 4 separate navies improvising in the same general direction, closed the gaps faster than the umbral formation could adapt to losing them. High, the umbral choir retreated further this time, past the edge of any survey the Joint Fleet had ever charted, up into a dark nobody had followed them into yet, and nobody knew this time either whether they would come back a third time. High. What everyone did know this time was what they were coming back to find. An alliance 7 years into practicing being an alliance. A Hanta species once measured only by how little of itself it had shown, now sitting, unquestioned, at the center of the table that had once decided it did not belong there at all. Vashon sent one message to Castellan the day after the second battle. I had said in its entirety, "They came back, we held. You were right. It was possible." She wrote back from the same office, where she had once listened to a lieutenant tell her, at 3 in the morning, that the impossible had just asked for help. "We were right," she wrote. "It was possible. What comes next?" His reply took him 3 hours, which for Vashon was a very long time to consider 4 words. "Everything," he wrote, "everything comes next." She read it twice, set it down, and picked up her next report, because there was always a next report, and that, she had come to understand, in the 7 years since a coffee cup had been set down very carefully on a console at 3 in the morning, was not a burden. It was the whole point. Somewhere on Auralite Station, in a joint command building that had not existed the first time any of this started, Lieutenant Dario Reyes filed a routine patrol report and went looking for coffee and found, as he usually did these days, that Dr. Soren Cade had already made a pot and left the last cup out for whoever needed it most. High, somewhere on Earth, a boy who had once wanted to build something nobody thanked him for was, at 16, 3 years into an engineering program he had chosen, without telling his mother's old colleagues why. Her, though several of them had quietly guessed. Somewhere past the rift, in the dark nobody had followed the umbral choir into yet. Something was almost certainly still moving, still deciding, still unaccounted for in anyone's file. The Concord kept its files updated now that, more than any treaty clause or fleet number, Hawes was the part of the story people who had lived through both battles tended to mention first when asked what had actually changed. Not that humanity had proven itself. Proof, it turned out, had never really been the problem. The problem had been a habit of not looking, and the habit, once broken, stayed broken, but in the small, unglamorous way that most real change actually happens, not in a single dramatic vote, but in 1,000 small decisions, made afterward by people who had learned, the hard way, what it cost to assume a file was still true simply because nobody had gotten around to checking it. Asterisk, end of episode. The line held again. It cost more than anyone at the long table has ever said out loud in a formal session, opined, and it proved something the Concord spent 94 years refusing to believe, that the size of a file is not the size of the people it fails to describe. A heart. If you were building something in secret for 22 years, with no guarantee anyone would ever thank you for it, what would it take for you to keep going? Hi, tell us in the comments. If you want to know what Threll Vachon found in that 22-year gap in humanity's file the night before everything changed, the file he never quite finished reading, subscribe, because that's where episode 5 picks up. Hard. And if you haven't seen how the Concorde's emergency channels got fast enough to save a war in the first place, go back and watch the story of the convoy that started it. Episode 3. It is not a weapon.